Today I'm speaking with Abdul, who's a panelist on the Thought Adventure podcast about the contingency arguments and then the argument for the necessary being. So this is part of the philosophical sort of series that I started. So thank you so much, Abdul. Jazakallah khair for being here.
Well,
and
yeah, thank
spending
you.
some time.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And so the point of this podcast is to really, I know you guys do a great job on the Thought Adventure podcast, but yesterday I checked one of your podcasts. I think it was like 3 or 4 hours about the evil versus good. And sometimes it might get a bit confusing for people, and not everybody has a lot of time to go through this. So I just want to kind of use this time to explain some of these things for like a layman people or people who are not really trained in philosophy, and just kind of dumb it down basically.
Totally understand, and you're right that I mean, sometimes the philosophical lingo can really get in the way, sometimes it does seem that there is this like over intellectualizing of like religion and belief in general within these philosophical circles, because the arguments that are put forward and the concepts and the discussions are sometimes, they seem so complicated, they seem specialized. So like maybe I want to talk about a bit about in the beginning about philosophical arguments in general, if you give me the chance to do that, because I think it's very important for people to know what role philosophical arguments play in your belief as a person.
Yeah, definitely.
Because if you know, if a person who isn't familiar with these philosophical terminologies and arguments is like watches some of these streams and comes across these very sophisticated arguments with like complicated terminology, then they're like, well, I don't understand what's going on. You know, is my belief in the right place? Do I need to understand this in order to believe? So I think sometimes that might be like at the back of some people's heads. So I think it might be important to touch on that a bit.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we can start with like a brief background. Like, do you have, I don't know, maybe something about yourself? Are you like a born Muslim? You live in the States, or what's your kind of story?
Yeah, I'm a born Muslim. I was born in Canada, and my background is Egyptian. Okay. So I was me and my whole family's in Canada. I currently live in Europe. My wife is from Sweden. She's of a Bosnian background, so it's a bit of a mixed.
So you live in Sweden now,
or? Yeah, I live in Sweden, and my wife is from here. She was born here. She's originally Bosnian, so we're a very diverse family, and yeah, I was born Muslim. I was always interested, like early on in like interfaith dialogues with Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Always interested about like the fundamentals of belief and why we believe and stuff like that. And when with the new atheist movement that I don't know, was it 2003, 2004, that really got me interested in, it shifted the interest to atheism and philosophy. And I went through certain phases of like questioning and doubts about belief and stuff like that, and that's really what got me to dig a bit deeper into these questions. And yeah, here we are. I intend to do a master's in philosophy sometime soon, and right now we're with the guys on the Thought Adventure podcast, and I mean, hopefully it goes places, inshallah.
Yeah, you're doing a great job, and I'm a convert, so I reverted like earlier this year for 9 months. And like this was the base of my faith, these arguments, like, but they were from like presented by Mohammed Hijab or some other guys like 2 years ago. But I couldn't stop thinking about these things. And of course, my faith is not based just on these arguments. Of course, I definitely agree with that. But it's good to have a grounding in these things, although I'm not an expert by any means. I just know like some basics. So
you know enough. You just need to know enough. That's really what you need to know. Yeah. So yeah, I guess maybe that is a good segue into what I was talking about earlier about like philosophical arguments and belief, right? And like what you're saying right now, right? How you're not an expert, but you know some stuff. Well, that is really the case most of the time for everything we believe, right? I mean, So let's speak of a layman who believes in that a certain scientific theory is true, a well-established scientific theory, and let's say they're well read on the scientific theory. Well, this person is not an expert and they just know some stuff, but they would know enough to make their belief that this theory is is true justified. So that's really the nature of our beliefs in general. We have sufficient information that makes us assent to a certain proposition or adopt a position. And sometimes people think they have to answer all questions about a certain worldview before adopting it. And sometimes there's this anxiety with like the idea of doubts. And this applies to like Muslims, Christians, even atheists. I mean, when you have questions about your worldviews, sometimes you assume you have to answer every single question before being reasonable in adopting your worldview. Well, that's not really the case. I mean, for questions that are absolute defeaters, that if there is a question that makes your belief unjustified, if there's a question that makes you puts you in a contradictory position where you believe something that is irrational, then fine. And that's an essential question that must be answered. But there's always going to be questions that you don't have an answer to, and that's fine as long as it's not detrimental to your position, as long as it doesn't like serve as a complete defeater for your position. So I mean, I just wanted to talk a bit about that part, the philosophical argumentation and the role it plays, because as I mentioned earlier, the whole over intellectualizing of belief, and it seems that there is this very high standard for what it means to be justified in your belief, and that's just really not true. And like from my position, I think that these philosophical discussions we have, these very sophisticated philosophical discussions, these philosophical arguments in general, the conclusions we reach through these philosophical arguments and the concepts that we speak about in these philosophical arguments are accessible at a very basic level. They are implicitly accessible for the layperson who doesn't really care about philosophy. Take the concept of contingency, which we're going to talk about in a while, for example, that contingent things requiring explanations, or whatever principle of sufficient reason we're going to adopt. People generally have that intuition. They have that rational basis for their belief. If you go and ask a simple person, why do you believe that everything has a creator? Well, they're going to start talking about some like causal principle. They're not going to use the word causal principle, but they're going to speak about like explanation. Well, where did it come from? What explains it? So people have this implicit rational access to these concepts anyway, and I prefer a theory of metaphilosophy, and metaphilosophy is basically the study of what philosophy is, where basically philosophy is just a contribution to human understanding. It serves as something that helps us articulate things that we already know. Nothing that I'm going to say about the very broad basic concepts I'm going to talk about isn't something that people generally understand rationally, at a foundational level. And people have this implicit access to these things. So the idea is, and this theory of metaphilosophy, by the way, it's proposed by a philosopher named Hacker. It's a Wittgensteinian view, and it's not something that's at all just made up. So I think the foundations of belief are rationally accessible, even the ones that we're going to talk about in these cosmological arguments. The idea here is that once you do, step out of your comfort zone, right, and you're exposed to these arguments, you're exposed to arguments that critique your belief philosophically, and then you're faced with all these big words and complicated discussions. Well, then you need to make a decision. Do you want to? Are you interested in responding to these arguments or not? because most people, from what I see, like sometimes don't even understand the arguments posed, against their beliefs, and somehow there's suddenly some kind of doubt, and there are like psychological, I guess, reasons for that. Well, maybe the person presenting it is like very confident. Maybe it's just the trend of this day and time that there is a certain philosophical view that contradicts your worldview, and so many people are talking about it, and you have these people who are viewed as intellectuals who advocate for it. So without even understanding what they're saying, there's something intimidating about what's going on. You need to understand whether it's basically a psychological or emotional challenge that you're facing, or an intellectual challenge. If it's an intellectual challenge, then you should be able to articulate the arguments that are being made against your worldview. You should be able to understand them. Most times people don't really understand them, and they need to then realize that it's not really an intellectual challenge that they're facing. It's more of a psychological or emotional challenge. And but once you do understand them, and if you are interested, if you find it challenging, of course, then you need to answer the questions. And this Richard Swinburne, he has this view, he calls it the principle of credulity, right? Where when you're within your circle, you have certain beliefs that just seem obvious, and you're well within your rational rights to believe them, if just things that seem to be true, right? Once you're presented with evidence to the contrary, once you step out of that circle, then you might have some work to do. So and that's the situation we're dealing with. And this is, by the way, even within an Islamic paradigm, it's true, because we don't believe that people are just, people in every corner of the world who haven't heard of Islam or have never been presented with an unadulterated form of Islam are just going to get thrown in hell. No, we believe that people need to be presented with things in order for them to believe it. And it's not really a binary thing. It's not an on-off button. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge people based on these numerous factors, and belief formation is a complicated thing that Allah understands more than anybody.
Also, Allah guides, so like you must be really open to this. I remember when I was an atheist and I thought I know everything, like you couldn't tell me nothing. So, and then when I saw these challenges and going to these kalam arguments, it like challenged the core of my worldview, and I was really scared to go there. And then it really shook me, and I said like, well, I'm more logical than these Muslims or whoever. And then it really showed me like I have nothing. So I needed to quickly change but I had a cognitive dissonance. I had like a couple of months where I was living in this like weird world where I still believe in this, but I know it's not true. So this is the point where people don't want to go, because it's very uncomfortable. It's like changing your base belief system. And it didn't happen when I went from Christianity, because I was brought up as a Christian, to atheism. It was like very quick. It was like just adopting atheism, because Christianity doesn't make sense at 15. Everybody just kind of like loses their religion in the West. It's kind of normal to be an atheist, but why is that a norm? Like, I wasn't exposed to Islam. I didn't even know any other worldview. I just thought like, this is norm. I'm just going to adopt this atheism without even knowing it. So
yes, I mean external influences are serious, right? I mean you can't, it's not really about forming a belief in a vacuum. There are serious external influences, and this is not something that's not really, this is something that's taken into account. Allah brings everything into account when he's judging a person. That's why, like in Islam, like if a person dies, if a non-Muslim dies, right, we're allowed to theoretically say, we're to make the claim from within a theological paradigm that kufr leads to hell, right? Non-belief leads to hell. But we're not allowed specifying individuals, saying this person, because he died, this person is in hell. That's a huge sin in Islam. It's called ta'alli. You're not allowed to specify. The reason for that is somewhat related to what we're talking about right now, that people will go through so many things that you don't know. You just judge by the apparent, but their ultimate judgment is not for you or me to make. And so I guess that's just a good starting point to help people understand, the broader context, and in what context philosophical arguments are important. They are important in a certain context. They're not like, they're not absolutely necessary for you to have rationally justified belief. People have rational beliefs and they rationalize their belief outside of the realm of this, of analytic philosophy, and even within an Islamic context, traditionally, many of the things we're talking about are spoken about in traditional language in a very rigorous way. And many of the people who are familiar with these discussions, if they hear these, modern Western analytic discussions about these topics, sometimes they won't be familiar with this, and they'll think, well, there's new stuff going on. I think, although there are always developments, I just think they aren't as significant as many people think.
Yeah, I remember when people asked me how I became a Muslim, and I told them, they were like, Muslims told me they never heard of these arguments. They don't know these things. Their belief is grounded in different, like, they came to it differently. And I think that's true for any people, because you can have, like, not everybody has even capability to grasp these things. Like, you have to, the faith cannot be based just on IQ or just on intellectual beliefs, but it is important, of course. And with the causal chain, just small kids always ask, like, why, where did it come from? Like, this is fitra, this is like pretty basic, and people want to know the causal chain, where it leads. It's natural in them. So
nobody doesn't ask these questions. Everybody does. It's just
it's just, again, people say today, like, oh, I don't want to think about it. Like, none of my colleagues or people I know thinks about these things. They just think, like, philosophy is useless, like religion completely useless. But they've adopted a worldview without even knowing it. Like, it's funny, but
exactly. That's often the problem we face with some internet atheists. And I mean, to be fair, you can be found on all sides, really.
But they are not really even atheists. They are just like something. I don't even know if they are atheists.
They think that their position doesn't have any, like, philosophical underpinnings. They think that they're not adopting philosophical positions, when in fact, they really are. And there's a saying, I don't know who it's by, but it says that, if you something to the effect of, basically, denying philosophy is basically being a bad philosopher, because you need to do philosophy in order to deny the relevance of philosophy. And philosophy here, I mean it in, like, the broader sense, like reason, the importance of reason. So yeah, I mean, it's really important to have that broader picture if you're interested in these discussions. I think that's essential. It's crucial.
Yeah. So today we have a couple of things we can talk about, and I'm not sure how they relate to each other, because I don't know if they follow logically. But there's the concept of necessary being, and this is what people are scared of if they're atheists. And that there's the contingency argument, the Kalam argument. But maybe we can start with this. And I mean, I've talked about this before, but maybe we can sum up from maybe one point of view, the contingency argument, and just go. I'll go with you on it, and maybe we'll see where we get from there.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess we can speak broadly about the concepts and maybe discuss, an informal form of the argument throughout. So I mean, so contingency arguments is basically part of a family of arguments. Cosmological arguments in general is like the umbrella term. You discussed the Kalam cosmological argument with Jake, right? Which is a form of, the broader family of cosmological arguments. So cosmological arguments encompass both the Kalam cosmological argument in its different formulations and contingency arguments in their different formulations. And cosmological arguments go all the way back to Aristotle, right? And it developed through Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and all the way to our modern times. And of course, also during the Enlightenment period with Leibniz. I mean, Leibniz is famous for the Leibnizian principle of sufficient reason, right? And we're going to get to what that is later. But then there's a very rich tradition for cosmological arguments that goes way back to Aristotle. I mean, even to Plato. And but again, this doesn't mean that before Aristotle and Plato, nobody thought about causality or what brought the world into being. Clearly not. We're speaking about formally constructing arguments on the basis of these conceptions that we already have, these ideas that we already have and implicitly have rational access to as humans. So yeah, contemporary philosophers also speak about this. There's Bruce Craig. Craig is famous for the Kalam cosmological argument. He's famous for basically popularizing the Kalam cosmological argument that was basically proposed by Al-Ghazali, and because Al-Ghazali developed it onwards from Ibn Sina to make it a causal argument, like the one you discussed with Jake, that deals with infinities, right? So it's a causal argument that deals with infinities. But I think most formulations of the contingency argument aren't really concerned with infinities. They're concerned with this idea of contingency. They're concerned with these the idea of contingent things and these modal categories. We call modal basically means when you talk about modal logic, you're talking about the logic of necessity and possibility, right? So these are terms that I want to explain them. There are possible things, there are necessary things, there are contingent things, right? So a possible thing is basically something that can exist, right? And when you talk about logical possibility, you talk about basically something that is not a contradiction, right? So you could think of the most absurd things here, right? Like as long as it's not a contradiction, as long as it's not A and not A, or like, as long as it doesn't imply A and not A, then it's logically possible, right? So this is it's a very broad category, and there are logically necessary things. So necessary things are things that could not fail to exist, or must be true. Like there's logical and mathematical necessities, right? Like 1 + 1 = 2. That's necessary. And we want to say that it is necessary in every possible world. Possible world here can be confusing to some people. Some people might be thinking of like real worlds in their head that, when I say possible worlds, I'm thinking of like a container that has a bunch of different worlds. No, possible world semantics basically refers to in modal categories, ways the world could have been. It's almost just a conceptual thing, right? Like for example, we want to say that I could have existed with 1 less hair on my head. I mean,
but
most people
1 + 1 would still be 2 in that world.
Exactly. So that's a possible world where I exist, where there's 1 less hair on my head, right? But what's common between that possible world and this possible world? Well, there can be contingent things that are common. Like there can be possible things that are still common. For example, my existence. But what's necessarily common are basically those things that must be true in every possible world. So there is no possible world in which you can say that 1 + 1 is not equal to 2, right? So
is there is there even a way to attack this premise, like where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2?
I mean, people try to. If you're talking about, well, you see, in philosophy, there are people who attack everything, right? So you've got like non-classical alternative what's it called, logic, right? Like you've got diaphyletism, right? We've got that basically accepts true contradictions. There's a man named Graham Priest who argues for the possibility of true contradictions. And there are other people who do that as well on the basis of things, many things, but I've seen people argue for it or propose this model of logic on the basis of things like the liar's paradox, right? So clearly, if you're just talking about like, well, can somebody have an opinion? Yes, but it's just how seriously do you want to take that opinion? I don't know how many people in the world would entertain the possibility that something can be both true and false at the same time in the same way. I mean,
so that's a good thing, because oftentimes we don't understand what is actually a contradiction, because sometimes we think something's a contradiction, but actually it isn't a contradiction, and sometimes it is a contradiction. So I don't know if this is like off topic slightly, but Can you kind
Not
of?
necessarily, but like
Yeah.
yeah. So we have a whole stream about this. I think it was the last before this last Sunday's one. It's called "What's Logic Got to Do with It?" or something like that, right? And we basically go through this. But a contradiction is basically A and not A. So basically, a proposition being both true and false at the same time in the same way, right? And at the same time in the same way is important. So let me think of an example. If I say that a ball is, and I might confuse logical possibility or metaphysical possibility here, but that's just a technicality. But if I say that a ball is yellow, right? So let's call the ball the ball, right? So the ball is yellow, and then I say a different a different statement about the ball. The ball is not yellow. Well, it depends on whether I mean those two statements in the exact same way. So, for example, I could be looking at the ball from one angle and seeing yellow, and then looking at it from another and seeing not yellow. You know those, I don't know what they call them. You know those pictures that you look at from different angles and you see different things, right? So is that a contradiction? I mean, that's the question. No, because I'm not saying that it's yellow and not yellow at the same time in the same way. I'm just describing two different aspects of the thing. But if I mean those two propositions in the exact same way, if I say a ball is, all yellow all around and blue all around, so yellow all around and not yellow all around, at the same time in the same way, that is a true contradiction. So you just need to take the one statement, the ball is yellow all around, and that would be both true and false at the same time in the same way. That's logically impossible, and in the case of the ball, it would be a metaphysical impossibility. So it's important, and this is a very good question, because some people, a lot of times, and that's why we did that whole stream, because a lot of times people don't know how to spot logical contradictions, right? So the term, like, logical contradiction is really overused sometimes in these discussions. So yeah, so that's contradictions, and you want to say that a contradiction is, logically impossible and metaphysically impossible. So there is no possible world where a proposition is both true and false at the same time in the same way. You want to say that that's absent from any possible world, right?
Right.
So yeah, so there are the possible things, and then there are the necessary things, right? So in possible world semantics, right, something contingent is something that exists in a possible world but could have failed to exist, like you and I, right? Yeah. So you want to say that we are contingent beings because we exist, but we could have failed to exist. So something that does not exist in all possible worlds is contingent. Something that exists in all possible worlds is necessary. That's very important. And we often start off by this observation of contingent things, and that's how we make our way towards these arguments, towards these cosmological arguments, right? Because this is where we're going to start talking about principles of sufficient reason and things having explanations. So we want to say that explanations exist. I mean, so that fact on its own, nobody's going to disagree with you. Again, some might, but you might want to avoid talking to those, right? So explanations exist, right? Some things have explanations, right? So from here, we want to say, well, we want to propose a principle of sufficient reason and say, well, wait, how far do we want to take this principle of explanation? Do all things in existence have explanations? Is it some things that have explanations? Is it a certain modal category, like contingent or necessary, one that has an explanation and the other that does not? And this is really crucial, right? So Leibniz had this very strong principle of sufficient reason that, something along the lines of every every existing thing and every positive fact must have an explanation, right? And recently some people attack that, right? Like you've got all the way from like human Kant themselves. They critique the contingency argument as a whole. Like for Hume, for example, it was on the basis of the causal principle explanation, because we know that Hume was the kind of skeptic who basically denied causality altogether. Denied it in a certain context, in a philosophical context. I mean, he lived as if causality was real, but within certain contexts, at least from an epistemic perspective, he said it wasn't accessible. And on that basis, he critiqued it, and there have been many critiques of the contingency argument ever since. Most of which I think, like from my perspective, aren't they don't work. I mean, but clearly, I mean, you see, you need to understand that Western analytic philosophy over the past 200 years or so has basically been run by a sort of like naturalist movement, at least methodologically naturalist, not necessarily philosophically naturalist. But there's been a lot of like physicalist trends throughout these couple of centuries.
So what do you mean by naturalist, for people who don't know? What do you mean by naturalist?
So naturalism, so when I say philosophical naturalism, it's the view that nature is all that exists. And that's, it's going to be a bit more complicated than that, because then it's going to depend what you mean by nature and where you draw the line between naturalism and supernaturalism. But naturalism, I could just basically say that it's the view that only natural things exist. It's a very broad term. You can think of it as non-theism, but some people would disagree, because let's say if a non-theist is like a Platonist, for example, some Platonists would classify themselves as non-naturalist, non-naturalist, non-theists. So it depends. And Platonism is a whole other can of worms. We don't have to go into that, but it's just the belief in like that there really exists abstract object in a Platonist sense. So there has been pushback.
So I'm just asking if this is like a principle they adopt without basically challenging it, this naturalism. So they kind of work from this principle without questioning, like, because they can get into trouble, because I've heard recently there are these weird philosophical trends where you say like, okay, there's suffering in the world, so therefore if you have babies, you're actually doing morally wrong thing and you should just kill everybody should be dead. And that's only in this worldview this makes sense, like only if you adopt this.
Yeah, it would lead to these kinds of absurdities. I mean, many avoid it, of course, but then it does. I think if we're consistent, then many understandings of naturalism would at least be more likely to lead to these kinds of things, and it's a bit like it's about the reductive approach they take, and like we mentioned Hume, right? So Hume would deny things like causality because his very radical empiricist approach. Well, he would say things like, I see A, then I see B, but I don't see a link between A and B. I see, like a pool ball hitting another pool ball, and then the other ball moves, but I can't be sure that one pool ball caused the other pool ball to move. And he was consistent in the sense that, well, if you're going to take this radical empiricist approach, then that's the radical kind of skepticism it's going to lead you to. And again, it's not like he lived like that. He acknowledged that, as soon as he steps out of his study room, well, he's going to live like everybody else. I mean, things have, if you're hungry, you're going to get up and eat. I mean, it's not, so yeah, in that sense, I think denying causality is completely ridiculous, nonsensical, but there are all kinds of nonsensical views in philosophy. And other critiques of the contingency argument, of course, they can be reasonable. Like there have been attacks on the idea of the principle of sufficient reason as well, like, and specifically a strong principle of sufficient reason where everything has an explanation. And of course, the defenses of principles of sufficient reason is pretty straightforward, at least intuitively. Like, we think things have explanations. So some people say that it's just a self-evident truth. in the sense that once you understand what the words of the sentence are, that, things have explanations, you don't need more information to accept the fact that things have explanations. And it's sometimes I view it as kind of self-defeating for why you would, deny that. Because like, if you deny it and say, well, hey, why should I accept that things have explanations? Then you're implicitly acknowledging that you need explanations, because you're asking me for an explanation to accept the principle of explanation. But yeah, then again, they might push back and say, well, I might think there's an explanation for this particular thing, but it doesn't have to be for everything. But generally,
like, I can see this from atheistic point of view. I would be one of those guys, because that leads me to then questioning the bigger and bigger and bigger. Exactly. And I want to avoid that, right? Because I don't have answers.
Yeah, and you know what? Because it's interesting you said that. It's really interesting you said that, because there have been, like, recent proposals of weaker principles of sufficient reason, like Proust, for example. He proposed a weaker form of a principle of sufficient reason, which basically talks about the fact that it's possible that certain contingent facts have explanations. It doesn't say it's necessary, just possible. And through modal logic, and modal logic I don't think we're going to get into any detail about that. It's a bit complicated, but if you look into modal logic, it's basically implied. It's philosophers have realized that accepting this weak principle of sufficient reason leads you to the same conclusion, that a strong principle of sufficient reason is true. The proof of this is complicated, but you can take my word for it, because even atheist philosophers acknowledge this, like Graham Oppy, right? So accepting a weak principle of sufficient reason, that contingent things possibly have explanations, certain contingent facts possibly have explanations, it actually implies a strong principle of sufficient reason. And the way we do this is, through modal logic and the system S5, that states that if it is possible that something is necessary, then that thing is necessarily true. So the possibility of something necessary implies its necessity. That's I believe, I can't really remember, I believe that's part of Proust's approach. Proust and Gale, they wrote about a new cosmological argument, where they discuss this. But yeah, and after acknowledging that a weaker principle of sufficient reason basically takes you to the same place, many atheists, including atheist philosophers, rejected the weaker one too. Now, where does that leave you? That leaves you with a very, very watered down version of explanation. In my view, at this point, you should just maybe be a radical skeptic and just assume that knowledge is not achievable, because I think that it is very reasonable to accept a weak principle of sufficient reason. And only when you see that, where it's going to take you, do, some people be like, oh, 1 second, I don't want this. Yeah. So they kind of backtrack. But yeah, so generally, whatever form of like, whether it's a strong or weak principle of sufficient reason, it can be utilized in a contingency argument, right? So basically, the contingency argument, some of the simplest formulations I've seen have come from Rasmussen, right? His name is Josh Rasmussen, and I think he does take from Ibn Sina quite a bit. And he has some formulations of the argument where he talks about, the set of contingent things, right? So just think of everything, all contingent things that exist. And when I say set here, don't take it too literally, because some people are going to talk about paradoxes from set theory and stuff like that. Very complicated discussions, but they're very avoidable. And Proust talks about this, Oppy talks about this. But generally speaking, think of all contingent things, right? Do you tell me, do you think that all contingent things are contingent? Do you think the set of everything contingent is itself contingent? Well, maybe first we're going to have to think of how to identify a contingent thing. So how do you know something is contingent, right?
Yeah.
It seems like there is a bit of an intuitive appeal to that about what is contingent, because if I ask you if my chair is contingent, you're just gonna say yes right away. could the world have existed without my chair? You're going to say yes. And so one of the most obvious approaches to this question, in my view, is that, you know, there is something about contingent things that's just arbitrary and just, you know, you just didn't have to be the way it is. It could have been another way in terms of its causal properties. So we identify things in terms of the way they interact with the world, right? So things have different properties, right? So for example, water has a certain boiling point, and let's say a different kind of liquid like acid would have a different kind of boiling point. So based on these properties and other properties like its color, you know, the way it behaves, it moves, we identify things, we individuate them, right? And these are causal properties. They're basically about the way something interacts with its surroundings. And I think you can say this about most, if not all, properties. Even color it's really about causal interaction, the way something behaves in an environment. So there's something about this arbitrariness, and, you know, the fact that these properties are just very limited from a logical sense, that it, you know, it's red, but it could have been purple. It's purple, but it could have been blue. It boils at 100 degrees, but it could have boiled at 1,000.
Are these properties like set? Because what if I change properties? Do I change a thing? Do I change the essence, or did I just?
That's a good question. But I'm not sure it's directly related. Like, you're gonna get us into like bundle theory and stuff like that. Okay, but then it's about really. So it's about looking at something and identifying that this thing basically could have failed to exist, at least in a logical sense. Forget about like metaphysical modality, because some people say, well, how do you know that in the real world it could have? But we'll talk about that. But the point is that these things, like, you can ask the question, right? So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, right? Why not 117? Like why specifically? And then you're going to look for an explanation. And it seems like these limitations are going to give you explanations, right? And if it's at 117, you're going to ask the same question. You're going to look for explanations, and you're going to come up with like a hypothesis and a theory that explains why something behaves in a specific way. So at least like applying a weaker principle of sufficient reason, that at least possibly these things have explanations. And then back to my question about the collection of all contingent things. So an example I give is,
by all contingent things, do you actually mean like in the universe, or just like where?
Yeah, I see here we're not really concerned with the universe. We're concerned with just existence. Okay. So all of contingent reality, right? And so let's say that there are an infinite number of possible worlds, right? Well, let's say there are just 100 that are actualized, that are actual in the world, right? You want to ask the question of whether these are contingent, right? And one good way of thinking of it, of answering this question, because Russell has the critique, Bertrand Russell, he has the critique about the contingency argument, that, you know, just because a thing is contingent, it doesn't mean that the collection of things that, you know, the thing is a part of is itself contingent. It's like a composition fallacy, right? So for example, like, just because a brick is small, right, it doesn't mean that the wall that, you know, is made up of bricks is small. The wall can be very big, right? So sometimes you are not justified in making a jump from a property of a part to the property of a whole. Sometimes it doesn't apply. Sometimes the property of a part is not applicable to the whole. But the key point here is that that's not always the case. Some people would like you to believe that it's always the case, and they'll just shout it out, composition fallacy, but that's not always the case. For example, if the bricks are red, if the brick is red, and the wall is made of red bricks, then the wall is red. So there's no composition fallacy there. You want to know whether the property is relational or not. And a more intuitive way of thinking about it is I give an example of like my laptop, right? So my laptop will agree is a contingent thing, right? You can just pop out of existence. The world's not going to fall apart. Now, if I multiply my laptop by 10, that's not going to change anything. There's nothing about multiplying my laptop that's suddenly going to make it necessary. Oh, now that it's 10 laptops, we don't need an explanation anymore, right? Now, even if you multiply that by an infinity, I don't care. There's something about these set of existing laptops that is contingent. It still requires an explanation. So no matter how many, it just seems to be the case from, extrapolating from our own experience that multiplying contingent things doesn't turn them into necessary things. It's just not, it's not applicable, So it seems like the property, it just follows, right? The set of contingent things, there's going to be a certain aspect of, arbitrariness to whatever that is too. It's going to be limited in a certain way that's exactly the same as the things that we see around us. Well, I mean, just because it's much bigger, it can be even infinitely big. So, because remember, because in this discussion, we're not really concerned with infinities, right? So you can have an infinite number of contingent things that are all causally related. And who was it? Yeah, I think it was Hume who made this critique, right? So let's say you have an infinite number of things, right? And so infinite number of contingent things, each contingent thing explains the other, right?
Yeah.
Right. So my laptop is explained by the engineer who made it. The engineer is explained by his parents, and so on and so forth. And if you have an infinite chain, then, well, it seems like everything is explained, because every contingent thing is going to have a, antecedent explanation. And Hume was like, wait a second, I'm already giving you an explanation. So assuming it's an infinite chain, I'm already giving you explanation for everything in the contingent world. It seems ridiculous to ask me for more than that, right? And in reality, this doesn't really work, right? Because there are two senses in which we're asking for explanations, right? So there is the existence of contingent things and the fact that contingent things exist. So you can explain to me, like if I give you a let's say like some science experiment, right? Like let's say my little brother or something, does this science experiment and he has this glass box or whatever. I'm just making this up. And you explain everything that's happening within that glass box, right? So you're explaining the mechanisms to me of everything that's happening there. But you still haven't explained to me why this exists, right? And no analogy is perfect, because you might say, well, in reality, you haven't explained everything because the edges have external explanations and stuff. But the point is that you explaining the internal mechanism of something, right, doesn't explain to me why that thing is there in the first place. You can say all you want about the internal mechanism of that thing. You can talk to me about it all day. Nothing about that explanation tells me how it came to being, if it did come into being, or why it exists if it always existed, So, well, the question is whether we want to ask that further question, right? Well, does the conjunction in more Proustian language, because Proust makes the argument, does the conjunction of contingent things, does that have an explanation, even assuming it's infinite, right? And that's really the crucial question. So if it is contingent, and forget about details about weak and strong principles of sufficient reason, because I think going down that path just complicates it a bit. So I'm just going to speak a bit more like in more simple languages, more intuitively, right? So if the conjunction of all these contingent things, if that fact of reality, if just the collection, if you have it right in front of you, you take all contingent things, you put it in a box, right? It's right there. If this collection of things has the same features we just spoke about, remember, arbitrary limits, like why is it like this and not like that? Why does it behave in this certain way, but not like in all possible ways? Think about this collection of contingent things and the way they behave, right? They causally interact in a certain way, right? This collection has certain features. This fact of the existence of contingent things itself, right, is something we might also say that requires an explanation. So the question is, if we look for explanations regarding contingent things in general, because one of the defenses of the principle of sufficient reason is that it is a presupposition of knowledge and reason in the first place. Like, you can't have knowledge and reason without this presupposition of, this principle of explanation, right? If we're going to accept that it is a presupposition of explanation, which I think someone like William Rowe accepts, if we're going to accept that, then we're going to ask for some kind of consistency between, the fact that we look at contingent things around us, and we know and by know here, I mean with like psychological certainty, that, okay, the arbitrariness of the things around us, these arbitrary features and these contingent things require explanations external to themselves. And then we look at the set of all contingent things. If nothing really changed, if we're looking at, a property of contingency that is similar, right? Then what's stopping us from asking the exact same question? That's the crucial issue here. What's stopping us from asking the same question? Because we're looking at the same thing from a certain angle, like if you want to say it's arbitrary and limited and stuff, and from another angle, if you want to ask about the proposition contingent facts exist, like why they exist. And if we're going to be consistent in our methodology, then we're just going to go all the way and say, well, fine, the set of all contingent things has an explanation, right? At least you're going to assume it, At least it's reasonable to believe, right? And I think denying it has serious costs. So yeah, I think it has, denying this has serious costs, because like for example, Rob Koons, who's one of the like contemporary proponents of the contingency argument, he wrote a few very, very good papers about it. He brings this point up with Proust. I don't remember where, but he says that because sorry, not Proust. I'm sorry. I'm distracted with Graham Oppie, right? So he brings this point up with Graham Oppie, because Graham Oppie accepts that something necessary exists. Like you could say that Graham Oppie accepts a stage one cosmological argument, right? Because cosmological arguments are generally divided into two categories. Stage one and stage two. Stage two is where you establish something necessary exists. Did I just say stage two? Stage one, establish something necessary exists. Stage two tries to make the inference from something necessary to God, that necessary thing that exists is God, right? So you could say in a certain context that Graham Proust, like he's at least in terms of the conclusion, he accepts a stage one contingency argument, but he says that the initial state of the universe is that contingent, is that necessary thing that he was in, natural state. He explicitly says that it's not conscious, because for him consciousness is like causally downstream. Yeah?
So the initial state, what do you mean, the initial state before the Big Bang, or like right up? Like what is the initial state of the universe?
So there is, you could say the Big Bang. Like, so you could say the first, like T1, the first moment of time. I mean, there's a lot to say here, whether he thinks the initial state is eternal, always existed, or he thinks it's uncaused. I've seen him argue that there's no problem with it being uncaused, and I think it is the view that he favors, that it's just the initial state is just uncaused. It doesn't have a cause, right? And keep in mind, he doesn't necessarily mean by that it always existed, because that would make more sense. But no, he just means it's uncaused. I don't want to say popped into existence from nothing, because that's language that normally is not very charitable to the view. But in a sense, I think that's what it kind of boils down to. Yeah, because when you say from nothing, he's going to tell you, well, I'm not saying it's from anything. I'm telling you it's uncaused. But can you conceive of that? Do you even understand what I'm saying at this point? I mean, that's so he thinks of the initial state of the universe. Think of it, of whatever you want to think of it, as the necessary being, basically, right? It's also important to note that when we say
that being, there's no will, nothing. It's just like something, whatever.
Yeah, and I was just gonna elaborate that in philosophy, generally, when you say being, you don't necessarily mean something that's conscious. So a being is basically something with a positive ontology, something that exists, right? So the necessary thing for him is this initial state of the universe. And he's a naturalist, and what I like about him is that he's clear in what he says, because I understand what he means by naturalist. He says that the initial state is not conscious, and he's not a realist. I think about numbers and stuff like that, and so he doesn't. I don't think he believes in abstract objects. He's a nominalist, and he says that, well, it's uncaused, and the explanation he gives is that it's necessary. That's the only explanation he thinks he needs to give. And he acknowledges that it's some kind of brute contingency, right? So it is a contingent state of affairs, right? In the sense that, as we agreed, right? But it's just brute. It just is. There's just no explanation. And of course, he thinks his theory is simple and stuff like that. But I mean, clearly, I think that's just that's very it's just completely off. But Kuhn's raised this concern with him, and he tells him that basically it's an epistemological concern. Like, if you think that this brute contingency can basically be the necessary foundation, right? And your own subjective experience, your consciousness right now, well, it seems like something that's contingent, right? And if you think something contingent can be necessary, then you need to be a skeptic. I mean, you need to think that, well, maybe my subjective contingent, contingent subjective first-person experience might be the necessary thing in reality, and I just might not remember or something. It takes you down this crazy path of, it's a slippery slope to radical skepticism. And I find that compelling. I don't remember the exact critique of Kuhn's, by the way, but I just took the gist of it, and I find my current understanding of it, like I think there's some plausibility behind that. There's something to consider. So the idea is that if you don't have this method to distinguish between what it is that is contingent and other things that, or the other thing that can be regarded as the necessary foundation of reality, then there are so many concerns, right? It's like, where do you draw the line? Which contingent thing are we going to see and say, okay, well, that's the stopping point? It seems like that's going to be arbitrary, right?
So I wanted to ask you, like, where does this lead? If we adopt this, okay, I agree, every contingent thing like is contingent, every set is contingent, everything. So like, where does it lead? Like, where does it go?
You mean where the argument goes if we accept these facts, right?
Yeah, if we accept these premises and stuff.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So this was just a problem, basically, with rejecting it, right? So yeah, again, it leads to serious problems. Let's put it that way, in my view. But then if you accept it, and the set of all contingent things, right, has an external explanation, and here we can talk about like contrastive and non-contrastive explanation, like an explanation that is beyond the thing, right? So if you want to explain something, it seems very plausible that the explanation is not going to be the thing itself. It seems that the explanation is not going to be the thing itself. It seems like an explanation, if you're going to understand it as something that removes, mystery, it seems like the explanation is going to be outside of it. It's not going to be something within the set of contingent things that explains contingent things, because the contingent things are the things we're trying to explain. So that would be, viciously circular. So if something explains the existence of the set of all contingent things, it necessarily must be not contingent, because you already have the set of all contingent things within that box, that hypothetical box that I put forward. So then we've come to a conclusion that it must be not contingent. And what does it mean to be not contingent?
Yeah.
To be necessary. So you arrive at a conclusion that, that there is a necessary foundation. So yeah, I mean, all in all, that's generally the gist of the argument. Of course, you can put it in like a more organized way. This is just me rambling, but it can be formally expressed,
So the necessary thing is being. It's still not God. It's just necessary.
Yeah, that's stage one.
Yeah.
That's stage one, and you arrive at something necessary. But I think we said a bit more than that, because we said that the necessary foundation is not this brute contingency, right?
Mm-hmm.
So well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean for it not to be a brute contingency? Oh my God. So what that means is that so that has certain explanations, and there are some there are many approaches I like in stage two arguments. Proust starts off by saying that, well, the explanation is either personal or scientific, is I think the terminology he uses. And well, every scientific explanation we know is contingent. We only know of these two kinds of explanations, scientific and personal. He makes that distinction. He has his defense of it, and necessarily it's personal because the scientific explanation is, however you're going to conceive of it, contingent. But there's another approach I really like, which is concerned with the whole arbitrary limits thing we were talking about, how contingent things have arbitrary limits. Contingent things have arbitrary limits, and Rasmussen discusses this a lot. And basically, it tries to show you that, the necessary foundation being arbitrarily limited would imply contingency. Now, what does that mean? So let's say the necessary foundation of reality has certain attributes. It has a property. So let's start with the property of power, because I mean, you'd have to agree it has that. It has causal power. It has the power to cause things, sustain things, because it is the foundation of things, right? Now, if you're going to set its power at, let's say, 73, or 218, like whatever random number comes to your head, that's going to be an arbitrary limitation that seems to imply a contingency, right? Well, it seems like there is something about the arbitrariness of certain properties that implies contingency and basically calls for, a utilization of the principle of sufficient reason. Well, why does it have this specific causal ability and not a bit more, not a bit less? There's a further consideration that within your theory, when you're building your theory or your hypothesis, there are certain costs, right? So if you're very specific about saying, well, there's this natural thing that has a specific power, that's much less plausible than saying that it is limitless, because being way too specific, and I think it's Draper, who's an atheist, he acknowledges this point, right? And he says that that there is an advantage to saying that, well, it's unlimited, and there is something about these ultimate explanations even within science. Scientists speak about this, about how there is something about ultimate explanations that basically should preclude this idea of arbitrariness. So, so if you say that the explanation of the universe, right, the ultimate explanation is, something with the power 4, it just seems that we haven't really solved much. You're going to ask questions about that thing, right? The same questions you ask about all contingent things. And we were already making that distinction between contingent and necessary. So this is the first point. It seems like it will be unlimited. And the least we can say about its properties that I think everybody should agree with is that it has power. It has causal ability, because we believe it caused the contingent world to exist, or at least it is the foundation that allows for the contingent world to exist. And its capacity to do so cannot be limited. So we've already, in a sense, got a certain attribute of God, which is omnipotence. Well, not exactly, of course. So you need to add the personal aspect to that, so able to actualize all possible worlds or all logically possible realities at will. But in a sense, the causal ability of this necessary foundation is unlimited, right? If we add other factors to that, well, it seems like if there's a will, right? It seems like if there's a will, you just add a will to this point. So if I have a will, if I have unlimited ability, well, you'll say that I'm able to do all things, all logically possible things. If at will, I can just do it, right? And now the will, right? Here's also one of the very interesting ways I like to think about it. There are many, and I'm just gonna choose a simple one that I've done a lot of thinking about. I don't know if you're familiar with the problem of other minds in philosophy. The problem of other minds is basically a skeptic's problem that's related to solipsism, that basically asks the question, how do you know that minds other than your own exist? So you have a mind, right? You have access to your subjective experience. But how do you know there is any other subjective experience other than yours? You don't have access to that. We have public access to trees, cars, you know, all kinds of things, all kinds of objective things in reality, but you can't see a person's experience. For all you know, I could be a zombie or a robot, and that could explain my behavior just as well as a mind can. You know, theoretically speaking, a robot can behave like this. Well, how do we know that minds other than our own exist? Well, there are clearly many proposed solutions, right? And I think you can just intuitively make an inference, and there's indirect observation and all that stuff. But one of the most basic ways that we simply know, so one of the most basic ways that let's say my son, right? So let me use my son as an example to try to simplify this as much as possible. My son, when he was, right now he's 3, and it's good to use him as an example because he's been giving us a lot of trouble. so he's 3, but when he was just younger, I think 1+, near around 2, he used to like freak out from like just plastic bags that are flying around, right? And he used to just see it and really freak out and run to me. And he only got over that fear when I explained to him that there is something making this plastic bag fly around. It's called wind. Come, let me show you how the wind is blowing and how it makes things move around. It's almost as if he thought that the bag is moving itself. Well, why would he think the bag is moving itself? Well, because it seems that everything in his experience is behaving in a predictable way. You know, cause, effect. You throw a rock down a hill, it just rolls over. You cut something, it splits in 2. The behavior of these things seems to be just predictable. It seems to be just things are just directly influenced by their, you know, physical stimuli, the physical things around them, right? But it seems like, well, when that was happening, it seemed like this thing is moving in a way that, wait, I don't know what's making it move. There's nothing outside of it that's explaining this behavior. And an example I give is like my cat. So I can explain the rock tumbling down the hill. It's just gravity. And I can reduce everything about that behavior to the physical components of the event. But then my cat here on the floor, if it suddenly decides to jump on the couch, well, I don't know what made it jump on the couch. It's not like there's anything around it, any antecedent causes that I can observe and say, okay, cause, effect. No, it seems like it made itself jump on the couch. Now, someone might say that, hey, you know what? I'm a determinist, and I don't believe their free will exists. And it is explained physically in our brains and stuff, right? There's just through neurology or neuronal interactions, we can explain these behaviors of what we see as free agents. But then I'll even grant that. I don't care about that point for this discussion. What I care about is why we think things have minds and free will. It's partly, of course, and I think this is a main component because of this non-deterministic behavior. By non-deterministic, I mean it seemingly non-deterministic behavior. And by non-deterministic, I mean that there is nothing in the physical surroundings of the occurrence that seems to account for what is happening. It seems like the thing is just making itself move. It seems like whatever the thing is causing is happening without a antecedent cause. Sorry, right? It seems like that way, right?
Yeah.
Now, yeah, so you might be a determinist. Okay, so we examined the brain. We're advancing in neurology, so maybe that isn't the case. Maybe there isn't free will. But wait a second. In that case, when we look at the necessary being and the necessary foundation, what's making it do what it does? What basically triggers? Stand above, please. Asa, please. But what triggers this, causal chain, if you want to call it, that allows it to sustain the contingent world? What's the causal action happening there in the beginning? Is it what's causing it to, let's say, create or cause things like the contingent world, right? Like it is only the contingent world. What is it that's doing that? Well, you can't appeal to anything external to it. You've already reached the foundation, right? And you can get into discussions about causal finitism here, though, which is the view that every causal chain must have a finite number of. But we don't even need to go there. So this necessary foundation. What's outside of the necessary foundation? Like what's behind it in terms of like causal hierarchy, right? Nothing, right? Because it's the foundation. Well, what's making it do things? Well, it must be doing it itself. There can't be an external influence on it. There isn't. If you say it's an internal mechanism within it, well, there's still going to be a starting point, a trigger that's just non-deterministic. And a lot of times naturalists, like atheists, appeal to indeterministic causation to say like how the universe began anyway. But I don't think that really helps their cause because of what I'm saying right now, at least from an epistemic perspective. It looks like I would have more justification in saying that this being or this thing, if they want to use that language, that causes things without any external compulsion, just non-deterministically makes things happen. I think I'm more justified in saying, hey, there's a mind acting here, than I would say about you. Because for you, at least there's physical things around you. Maybe I'm imagining, maybe you're a robot. But at least from an epistemic stance, if I'm going to be consistent with regard to this singular point about how I infer minds, it seems like just logically speaking, there's no escape from the fact that this necessary foundation is in fact doing things without any external influence. So as opposed to the plastic bag, that I explained to my son has wind that is controlling it, what am I going to tell him is controlling the necessary being? I can't point to anything. It seems to be more of a mind than anything I know, right?
And so also like just the fact that the world exists points to the fact that the being decided or willed to create, but it could also will not to create. But
exactly.
The world exists.
That's a very good point.
Like but this is actually like simple. Like even kids can understand. It's like you exist
exactly,
and like it's pretty simple. But like it makes sense. Like if it has a will, it could have decided not to do anything. Like, but
exactly, and this is a very, very good point. Because of course, as I mentioned, there are teleological aspects as well. You can talk about design, consciousness, many things, and many other things too. But then the point is, what you just mentioned is, you see, the thing is, the contingent world exists, right? So just to give like an extreme, like just to be hyperbolic about it, give an extreme example to make this clearer, right? Let's say that the contingent world is only like a red ball, right? Let's say it's a red ball, right? Because for me personally, the arbitrariness of a red ball isn't very different than the arbitrariness of our world. I mean, I'm a bit crazy when it comes to that, and how I just look at things around us and say, like, why are things like this? And I think a lot of people have that intuition. That so I think it's not very different. But I think it is an extreme example. So a red ball is the only contingent thing that exists, right? Let's assume that. Now you want to ask yourself a question, and this is where it goes to discussions on metaphysical modality, which is different. But just ask yourself a question: is, well, did this red ball have to exist? I think just asking that question is the same as asking, well, did every hair on my head have to exist? I don't think it's very different, at least qualitatively. Did my chair have to exist? Well, did this red ball, which is the only contingent thing that exists in our thought experiment, did it have to exist? No, it doesn't seem to be the case. In terms of logical possibility, at least, there are so many things that could have existed. Let's say an infinite number of things that could have existed. Well, do they all exist? I mean, are we going to be modal realists in the sense that we say that all possible worlds exist? Which I think would still imply that God exists, because, you know, if you say God is a logical possibility. But anyway, well, I think that's a huge cost. No one is going to want to commit to something like that. That's a huge ontological cost, which I don't think gets you away from the concept of God anyway. But if assume, like, the more intuitive, basic, observation that I think people can relate to, which is that some possible things exist. So let's say one world or 100, right? It would be still analogous to that red ball. Now, what's allowing for a red ball to exist as opposed to a blue ball or a green ball or a yellow ball or no ball at all, or any of the other infinite number of logical possibilities that could have been? Right? That seems to be an active choice, right? Right. And I mean, there are discussions about whether the choice is contingent. You know, some people say it collapses to necessitarianism, but Proust responds well to this point. But the point here is that these contingent things, as you've mentioned, the fact that it allowed for this to exist, right? You know, means it could have allowed for it to not to exist, because we don't want to say that everything in our reality had to exist. Well, if you think of the implication of that, if we're serious about our language and we're not just speaking epistemically in terms of epistemic possibility, then if truly there was a genuine possibility for some of the things in reality not to exist, well, then if we're going to take causality and explanation seriously, what makes that the case? There's something down at the beginning of the causal chain that's going to either allow for it to exist or not, unless you appeal to some kind of like true ontological indeterminacy where it just happens. It just happens to be the case. that seems to be, even if you do appeal to that seems to be an act of will, from what I said earlier about how non-determinacy or indeterminacy points to that kind of behavior, points to a mind, points to a will. I don't need to see anything about your features to know that you have a mind, right? Forget about talking to you. Just intuitively, on a basic level, I think at least, that the behavior of a thing, you know, is sufficient for me to infer a mind or deny a mind about it. And I'm not talking about intelligence. I don't need to even see intelligent behavior, right? I'm just talking about behavior, right? If it seems to be behaving in a way that's not determined by its surroundings, then it's going to look a bit spooky. It seems like something subjective is within this thing, and but then I might be wrong. But then am I wrong about the necessary foundation? No, it just logically follows that it is behaving in a way that is not determined by anything outside of it. No antecedent causes that are compelling it to behave the way it does. So on that basis, it seems like it has much more of a will and a mind than any of us do.
Yeah.
That's really the way I see it.
Yeah, it's a good way to wrap it up. But maybe last question. Many people say like, well, you decline this principle of infinity, then you say like God is eternal, and like you say something cannot come from nothing, but God came from like where did he come from? So I mean,
Yeah.
this is very simple maybe for you, but could
Yeah.
you maybe elaborate on this
Yeah.
objection?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, remember, we're not concerned with infinities in this argument specifically. So, I mean, we're even granting the possibility of infinities, right? So that's not a problem in this argument. But let's say you're talking about like the Kalam cosmological argument, the one you discussed with Jake. Well, that's not really a problem. First of all, when you're thinking of God, you're not thinking of like a countable infinity. You're thinking of a qualitative infinity. You're not thinking of a quantitative infinity. Second of all, you don't necessarily need to have a problem with all kinds of infinity to run the argument. I mean, one of the defenses of either like causal finitism or a finite past is really concerned with the impossibility of an actual infinite by successive addition. By successive addition means that, well, if you start counting now, you're never going to reach infinity. That's the gist of one of the arguments, basically. So that's a kind of infinity. I don't have to reject all kinds of infinity. But even if you're going to reject any kind of actual, numerable infinity, then that's just not really applicable to God, because it's not how we talk about God in terms of infinities, like countable infinities. And we don't think God, it depends on your view on God and time. But then again, so the critique really, I mean, this is one of the most basic objections that's very well discussed in the literature, defending the some of the, I think it's premise 2 of the Kalam cosmological argument in Craig's initial formulation. That doesn't require really denying the existence of all actual infinities. It's just specifically this kind of argument, it's the impossibility of an infinity by successive addition. But yeah, even if you have arguments like Hilbert's Hotel, for example, that denies the possibility of any kind of these countable infinities, that still doesn't apply to God. We're not saying the same thing about God. And as the second question, you said, well, nothing can exist without a cause. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying nothing can begin to exist without a cause. So no, you can't say nothing can exist without a cause. Just that
if it
nothing
has a
can
beginning.
Exactly. And God clearly doesn't have a beginning. The necessary foundation doesn't have a beginning. So the objections don't really apply.
Got it. Well, I think it's almost 9 p.m. so I gotta also wrap it up because my wife is waiting for dinner.
Yes.
But
yeah, same here, and I'm sorry for all the noise.
Yeah, you're in Europe actually. I'm in Prague, Czech Republic. So thank you so much for spending this time with us and explaining this. I think it was very good, and many people got a ton of value from this. So guys, comment below what was the best thought that you got from this podcast. And Jazakallah khair for being here, and hopefully we'll get a chance to catch up in future, maybe in a couple of weeks.
Jazakallah khair. Thanks for having me on, and looking forward to talking to you again, inshallah.
Definitely. Thank you, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you.